My parents told everyone I died in a car accident. I showed up at my own memorial service. There is a moment, usually quiet and unremarkable, when you realize you have been living inside someone else's story about you. Not a story built on malice, necessarily. Sometimes it's built on habit, on convenience, on the comfortable friction of a family that found its shape years ago and calcified around it. The mother who clicks her tongue. The father with his disappointed silences. The siblings who learned early on that hierarchies in a family are established young and rarely revised. You realize you have been assigned a role, and you have been performing it faithfully. Not because you believed it was true, but because you didn't yet understand that you were allowed to stop. Emily Carrick understood this on a November morning in Easterhouse, in a kitchen that smelled of toast and washing up liquid, when her mother said 8 words that would change the course of everything that followed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before you can understand what Emily did on January 11th, before you can truly feel the weight of what happened when she walked into that church and 73 people saw a dead woman come back to life, you need to understand who Emily was before any of this. You need to understand Easterhouse, and a council flat with thin walls, and a girl who taught herself to code at midnight with the bedroom light off, so nobody would know she was still awake. You need to understand what it does to a person to spend their entire childhood being told, in 100 different ways, that their mind is simply not the kind of mind that matters. Because that is where this story actually begins. Not in a church. Not at a memorial service. Not in a moment of triumph. It begins with a girl who believed them. Easterhouse sits in the east end of Glasgow, about 6 miles from the city centre, and if you've never been, the distance is larger than the map suggests. It's a place with its own particular sky, or at least it always seemed that way to Emily, low and grey and close to the rooftops, like a lid pressed down. The flat she grew up in was on the 3rd floor of a block on Aberdalgie Road, and from her bedroom window she could see the car park and a stretch of grass that nobody ever used for anything except cutting through to the bus stop. Her father, Duncan, worked at a distribution depot until the depot closed, and then he worked other jobs, shorter and less steady, the kind that put a particular look on a man's face if he carries them long enough. Her mother, Jean, kept the house and managed the money and carried the particular anxiety of someone who has watched a financial margin narrow from thin to almost nothing over the course of years. They were not cruel people, in the way that villains in stories are cruel. They were something more ordinary and in some ways more damaging. They were people who had learned to survive in a particular place and assumed that survival required staying within it. Emily was born 3rd, after Craig and before Megan. Craig was the clever one. That was the family verdict. Arrived at early and never revisited. He'd got decent marks in school, talked well at dinner, laughed at his father's jokes in a way that felt earned rather than obligatory. Megan was the pretty one, the social one, the one who seemed to know instinctively how rooms worked and how to make people feel good about themselves when it served her. And Emily was something else. Emily was the difficult one to categorize, which in a family that needed categories became the same as being the disappointing one. She struggled with some things in school, that was true. She wasn't naturally good at sitting still and absorbing information designed to be regurgitated in a specific format at a specific time. She found exams strange and artificial, as if someone had decided that knowledge should be demonstrated in exactly this way and no other. But what her teacher saw as distraction was something else entirely. From the age of 11, Emily had been teaching herself things her school had no interest in teaching her. Her uncle had given her an old laptop, secondhand and slow, and she'd used it the way other children use toys, dismantling it conceptually, learning its logic, following that logic into coding tutorials she found online, then into forums, then into practice, then into something she could actually build. By 14, she had made her first simple application. By 16, she was writing functional code in 3 languages. She'd failed her hires because she'd spent revision period rebuilding an app she'd been working on for 8 months because the app felt real and the hires felt like theater, and she'd made the choice that cost her the certificate but gave her something the certificate couldn't have. Her family saw the failed exams. They did not know about the app. That was the first time she understood the gap, the distance between what she was actually doing and what was visible to the people around her. She filed the understanding away without quite knowing what to do with it. The gap had been widening for years before she had a name for it. She remembered a specific afternoon when she was 13, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open, drawing what she would now recognize as a rudimentary database schema, boxes and arrows, the logic of how information connects to information. And her brother Craig had glanced at it on his way to the fridge and said, "What is that supposed to be?" She'd tried to explain it. He'd laughed. Not viciously, but with the casual dismissal of someone who hasn't considered that the person in front of them might know something they don't. "You're such a weirdo," he'd said affectionately enough, and taken his orange juice and left. She'd turned back to the notebook. She'd kept drawing. But she'd also folded the notebook slightly inward on the table, creating a small shield between the page and the kitchen, and she'd understood something that she wouldn't fully articulate until years later. That in this house, certain kinds of thinking needed to be done quietly. She remembered her father, coming home from the depot on an evening when she was 15, sitting down across from her with the weight of the day on him, asking what she was doing. She'd been deep in a tutorial about database architecture, the kind of thing that looks like incomprehensible text to someone who doesn't read code. She'd said she was learning programming. He'd looked at the screen for a moment, genuinely trying, she thought. This was before the trying stopped. And then said, "That doesn't seem very practical, love." Not with malice. With the specific practical concern of a man who has seen jobs disappear and who worries about his children in a world that has not been kind to him. She knew that. She had always known that. But the message was the same regardless of the intention behind it. What you are doing does not count as anything real. She remembered her mother watching her carry the laptop upstairs one evening when she was 16 and saying to Duncan in the kitchen, not quietly enough, "I don't know what she gets up to with that computer, but it's not normal." She had stood on the stairs and heard it and kept walking, carrying the laptop to her room, closing the door, opening the screen. She'd been debugging a piece of code for 3 days and was finally close to the solution, and the solution mattered to her more than her mother's assessment of her normality. She had always been that way. The work had always been more important than the opinion of people who didn't understand the work. The problem was that the people who didn't understand the work were also the people who had told her, from the very beginning, what kind of person she was. She got a job, then another, then started taking on freelance work, small contracts, websites and patches and fixes for local businesses who needed someone who knew what they were doing and couldn't afford anyone expensive. She lived at home, paid into the household, took up as little space as possible. She was 22 when she had the first real idea. Not a fix, not a patch, but something original. A logistics software platform built around a specific inefficiency she'd noticed in the distribution sector, something nobody had addressed with quite this approach. She spent 2 years building it in the evenings and on weekends, working the kind of hours that hollow you out, fueled by the specific energy of someone who has found the thing that actually matters to them. She did not tell her family what she was building. She'd tried that once, with a smaller project, and her mother had nodded with the expression of someone humoring a child. And her father had said something about being careful not to waste too much time on pipe dreams. So she stopped telling them. This is crucial to understand because her family would later describe her as secretive, as if secrecy were a personality flaw she'd chosen rather than a rational response to their feedback. She wasn't hiding. She was protecting. There's a difference, though it can be hard to see from the outside. The 2 years of building were not romantic. She wants to be clear about that if you're imagining it as a montage of late-night inspiration and gradually filling notebooks. It was grinding, repetitive, technically demanding work that frequently went wrong. She spent 3 months on one architectural problem that she solved incorrectly twice before she found the right approach, and the wrong solutions cost her weeks she couldn't get back. There were nights when she sat at her desk in the bedroom with the view of the car park and thought, seriously and without drama, that maybe her family was right, that maybe this was a pipe dream, that the clearest evidence she had of her own ability was built on nothing except her own conviction, and her own conviction might be the least reliable thing in the world if her whole family saw her differently. Those nights were real. She doesn't diminish them. She got up the next morning and kept going, not because she was certain, but because she had run out of alternatives that felt like truth. The work was the only thing that felt real. Everything else, the jobs, the freelancing, the flat on Aberdalgie Road, felt like the performance of a life, not the actual thing. She had one person she could talk to during those 2 years, in a limited and sideways kind of way. A developer she'd met through an online forum based in Aberdeen, who went by a username she'd never asked the story behind. They communicated almost entirely through the forum and occasionally through direct messages that were purely technical, debugging problems, architectural questions, the specific shorthand of people who understand the same systems. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. But he would respond to her technical questions with the seriousness of someone who had evaluated the question on its merits and found it worthy of a real answer. And this, the simple experience of being taken seriously, technically, by someone with no stake in underestimating her, was more sustaining than she would ever have expected. It was a small thing. It kept her going through several of the worst nights. She still doesn't know who he is. The moment she knew it was working was specific and undramatic. It was a Tuesday evening in February, in the bedroom, the rest of the flat quiet, a cup of tea gone cold beside her laptop. She ran the platform against a real distribution dataset she'd obtained legitimately through a contact at a logistics firm she'd done freelance work for, and the efficiency gain the platform generated was not what she'd projected. It was better. Not marginally better, significantly better, the kind of result that stops you typing and makes you run it again to check the numbers. She ran it 3 times. The result was the same each time. She sat back in her chair and looked at the numbers on the screen and understood, with the specific clarity of a thing that cannot be undone, that she had built something real. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. By the time she was 27, the platform was functional, polished, and demonstrably valuable. She'd done the work. She'd documented everything, built a prototype, tested it against real distribution data, and the numbers were what she'd believed they would be. She made quiet contact with a Manchester firm that had been publicly vocal about needing exactly what she'd built. The conversation moved faster than she'd expected. Within 3 months, she had initial funding secured. Within 4 months, she had a contract. The check was large enough that when she first saw the number in her account, she sat very still for a long time, not quite able to process it. She was still living at home at this point, sleeping in the same bedroom with the same view of the car park, wearing the same clothes, acting the same. The gap between the life she was secretly building and the life her family believed she was living had become enormous. She decided to tell them. One last conversation, she thought. One more attempt at honesty. She owed them that. She drove to Easter House on a Tuesday in November, wore her usual clothes, the Primark coat, the trainers with the worn soles, because even then, some careful part of her brain said, don't show them the change before they've understood it. Her hair was up. She looked exactly as she always had. She walked into the flat and sat down at the kitchen table, and her mother put the kettle on, and her father sat in his chair, and Emily tried to explain what she had built. She got about 4 sentences in. Her mother's arms crossed. Her father's expression went sideways, that particular sideways that meant he'd already decided. Emily kept going anyway, kept trying to sketch out the idea, the funding, the contract, the timeline, speaking carefully and clearly. Her mother cut her off mid-sentence. You've always been thick as mince, Emily. Stop pretending you're something you're not. There it was. 8 words, delivered not with rage, but with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact they've known for years. Her father's response came immediately, a short laugh. Not cruel laughter, almost affectionate laughter, which was somehow worse. And then, leave the thinking to people with proper brains. Emily sat with those words for a moment. She felt them land. She felt where they hit, somewhere in the chest, somewhere that had been braced for impact for years, and was still not quite ready for the actual blow. She was 27 years old. She had just signed a contract worth more money than her father would earn in 3 years at the depot, and her mother had just called her thick as mince in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in. She smiled. She nodded. She said something like, "You're probably right. I'm probably getting carried away." She finished her tea. She said goodbye. She walked back to her car. She drove to Merchant City. 6 hours later, she signed her first major client contract with the Manchester firm. The check cleared on a Tuesday. She changed her phone number on Wednesday. She did not go back. She drove away from Easter House on that Tuesday evening with her hands steady on the wheel and her eyes fixed on the road ahead. And she did not cry until she was through the Merchant City and parked in a side street she didn't know. Engine idling, the heater humming. The crying wasn't grief exactly. It was more like the release of pressure from something that had been sealed too long. She cried for her mother's kitchen and her father's laugh before it became something to brace against. She cried for the version of herself that had walked back into that flat with hope, with the precise, careful hope of someone who keeps trying despite the evidence, and had been sent away unchanged. And then the crying stopped, as crying always does, and she sat in the quiet car in the side street and thought with absolute clarity, "This is the last time I will be sent away unchanged." She found the room in Merchant City online that same evening. She signed the short-term lease digitally. She packed what she needed from her flat: the laptop, the external drives, the 3 notebooks of documentation, the good headphones, into 2 bags, and walked out. She did not leave a note. She texted a landlady she'd been renting a room from and gave notice. She stood on the pavement outside the new building in Merchant City at 11:45 at night and looked up at the Glasgow sky, orange-black, the particular color of a city that never goes fully dark, and breathed in the cold air and thought, now. You need to understand what the next 14 months look like from the outside, because the outside is all her family ever had. She rented a room in Merchant City. A small room, unremarkable, in a shared flat with 2 other people who kept their own hours and didn't ask questions. She worked 18-hour days with the focus of someone who has finally been let off a leash. She lived on meal deals from Tesco and coffee from the machine in a co-working space on Argyle Street where she'd rented a desk. She wore the same 3 outfits on rotation. She took the subway when she needed to get across the city. She looked, to anyone who saw her, like one of the thousands of young people grinding through early career uncertainty in Glasgow, slightly tired, slightly shabby, not yet arrived at wherever they were going. The appearance was not constructed. That's the thing that matters. She wasn't performing poverty. She genuinely wasn't spending money yet, not because she didn't have it, but because every pound she kept in the business was a pound working for her, and she hadn't yet reached the point where spending it on herself felt justified. She was doing what she'd always done, which was keeping her head down and building. The only difference was that now she was building something that was actually visible to anyone who looked, and she had no family who cared to look. Carrick Solutions was incorporated in January. By April, they had their first Glasgow hire. By July, they had 3. By September, they were featured in Tech Scotland magazine, a full 2-page spread with a photo of Emily at her desk in the co-working space, looking slightly serious and slightly surprised, which was accurate because she hadn't expected the photographer to show up quite as early as he had. The article mentioned the company valuation, $47 million in the first year of operation. It mentioned the Edinburgh expansion they were planning. It mentioned her name, her background, the fact that she was from Glasgow's East End. It was all there, public and searchable, indexed and findable by anyone who cared to type her name into Google. Her family did not type her name into Google. The first hire had been a young developer named Priya, 23, who had answered the job listing on LinkedIn with such direct and technically impressive confidence that Emily had replied within an hour and offered to meet the same week. She remembered sitting across from Priya in the co-working space kitchen, 2 mugs of bad filter coffee between them, explaining what she was building, watching Priya listen with the sharp, focused attention of someone evaluating whether they were being sold something real or something that would waste their time. She'd asked hard questions. Emily had answered them directly. At the end of the conversation, Priya had said, "I'll need to look at the code base before I agree to anything." And Emily had handed over her laptop on the spot, and Priya had scrolled through the architecture for 15 minutes in silence, and then said, "All right, when do I start?" That exchange, those 15 minutes, had been one of the best moments of Emily's professional life, because someone who was actually qualified to judge the work had looked at the work and found it good, and it had happened with no reference whatsoever to what Emily's family thought of her. By the time the Tech Scotland article came out, she had 6 people working for her and had renewed her desk in the co-working space twice, and was starting to look seriously at proper office space. She read the article twice, once quickly, once slowly, and felt something she recognized, carefully and without drama, as pride. Not the performance of pride, the actual thing. She had not had very many occasions to feel it before. It felt quieter than she'd expected, and more solid. The journalist who had written the piece had asked her at the end of the interview a question she hadn't anticipated. What had been the hardest part? She had expected herself to say something about the technical challenges, or the funding process, or the difficulty of growing a team quickly. Instead, she had heard herself say, doing it without anyone believing it was possible. The journalist had nodded and written something down, and then moved on. And the answer appeared in the article as a single quoted line that got more response than any other part of the piece. The comments on the digital version were something she had scrolled through one evening with a cup of tea, reading the responses of strangers, people who had recognized something in that sentence, who had left their own versions of it in the comment section, who had said, "Me too. I did something like that too. I built something while my family said I couldn't." She had not responded to any of them, but she had read all of them, and she had understood, reading them, that the experience she'd been living inside, the experience of succeeding in the complete absence of the people who should have been rooting for you, was not unusual. It was devastatingly common. And the fact that it was common did not make it smaller. It made it larger. It made it one of the defining experiences of the kind of people who build things, which is to say, people who are told they cannot. She received other things during those months. Her cousin Laura, who had always been quietly decent to Emily and maintained a low contact but warm connection with her, sent occasional messages checking in. From Laura, Emily pieced together the family's version of her life during her silence. They believed she was struggling. They believed she had failed at whatever she'd been attempting and was too proud or too embarrassed to come home. Her mother had told Laura that Emily was probably in some damp flat somewhere, too stubborn to admit she needs help. This was relayed to Emily with the specific discomfort of someone delivering news they know will sting. Emily had read it sitting at the desk in her co-working space, surrounded by the small team she'd assembled, and felt something complicated. Not quite hurt because she'd been vaccinated against their assessments years ago, but something like exhaustion. The exhaustion of being misread so completely by people who thought they knew you better than anyone. It was during this period, 8 months into her silence, that her sister Megan tracked her down. Emily still isn't entirely sure how Megan found her. Probably through social media, through the mutual contact they shared, through enough digital breadcrumbs that a determined person could follow. Megan called her work email. She must have found it somehow, and asked to meet. Emily agreed, because she missed certain things about her family, even while she did not miss what they did to her, and Megan had always been more bearable than the rest. They met at a cafe near George Square on a gray Wednesday morning. Emily arrived in the same coat, the same worn boots, coffee stained on the left cuff. Megan arrived in a good jacket and new trainers, and Emily watched her sister's eyes do a sweep on entry, coat, boots, bag, hair, that was so practiced as to be almost involuntary. The calculation was instant, and the conclusion was clearly what Megan had expected to find. Emily struggling. Emily diminished. Emily in need of the gentle guidance that Megan had always believed herself equipped to offer. Megan was kind about it, which made it worse. She bought them both coffee, steered Emily to a corner table, and began. It was a well-meaning monologue, careful and sympathetic in tone, about being realistic, about understanding one's limitations, about the particular wisdom of not reaching for things that are out of reach. Emily let her talk. She wrapped her hands around her cup and watched her sister's face. The slight furrow of genuine concern, the practiced tilt of someone delivering hard truths gently, and felt the distance between them as something measurable, something geographic. When Megan paused, Emily asked, very gently, what limitations she meant. Megan had patted her hand. You know what I mean. You're not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Mom and Dad are just trying to protect you from disappointment. Emily looked at her. She looked at her for long enough that Megan started to look slightly uncertain. Then Emily took a sip of her 280 latte, the same latte Megan had bought out of pity, and said nothing. She said nothing about the $340,000 sitting in the company account. She said nothing about the Manchester expansion or the 2 venture capital firms who had reached out in the previous month, or the 3 new hires she was planning, or the Edinburgh office she'd started scouting locations for. She said nothing because she had tried once to tell her family the truth in her mother's kitchen in Easterhouse, and she had learned exactly how much truth they were willing to receive. She said she'd think about what Megan had said. She said it was good to see her. She walked back out into George Square and stood for a moment in the wind coming off the Clyde, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. The specific grief of seeing someone you love look straight at you and see nothing. She walked back to the office, sat down at her desk, and opened her laptop. Priya was at the next desk, headphones on, frowning at a screen full of code. Their newest hire, a developer called Jamie, was on a call in the meeting room, pacing. The co-working space hummed with the ordinary mechanical sounds of people doing real work. Emily looked at the room around her and thought about Megan's face when she'd done the sweep at the cafe door. The coat, the boots, the fast calculation, the conclusion already reached before a word had been spoken. She thought about how much of what people see is what they have decided to see. She thought about how Megan had looked at her sister and found confirmation of what she already believed, the same way their mother had looked at her in the kitchen and found the same confirmation, the same way their father had laughed the laugh of a man whose assessment of the situation required no revision. She opened the folder with the Edinburgh office shortlist. There were 4 properties. She sent inquiry emails to all 4. Then she opened the venture capital correspondence and typed a reply setting up the call for the following week. The grief of the cafe was real and she carried it with her, but it did not touch the work. The work had never depended on their belief. That was the thing that had always been true, and that she finally understood all the way down. Here is what you need to understand about Emily's silence in the months that followed. It would be easy, and wrong, to read it as indifference. To assume that because she'd stopped reaching out, she'd stopped caring. The truth was more complicated because the truth is always more complicated. She cared. She thought about them. She missed her father's laugh before the laugh had become a weapon. She missed her mother's cooking, which was genuinely good. Proper mince and tatties, the kind of meal that contains a specific childhood memory in every bite. She missed Craig's occasional flashes of actual humor, before he'd learned that ranking the siblings was a way to elevate himself. She missed Megan's warmth, which was real even when it was condescending. What she could not bear was going back. Not yet. Not while she still had to prove something that she'd already proven to herself. She needed to finish what she'd started before she could face what she'd left. She knew this about herself, that she needed the work to be complete and visible before she could return to the people who'd said it was impossible. She wasn't proud of this. She understood it had costs, but she knew herself well enough to know it was true. And so she worked. She kept building. She hired 6 people in Manchester. She took the meeting with the Series A investors. She signed 3 new enterprise clients. She moved from the tiny rented room into a proper flat in Finiston, ground floor, bay window, close to the river. And she bought herself a decent sofa and a good coffee machine and felt for the first time in years like someone who was allowed to take up space. She was sitting on that sofa in November, reviewing documents for the $2-3 million property development deal that her company was finalizing, a joint venture the largest they'd attempted, when the first message came in. It was from an old school friend named Joanna Reed, sent to an email address that Emily had kept active from her school days, the one she barely checked anymore. The subject line was just Emily, and the body of the message was 3 sentences that Emily read twice before she understood them. Joanna was offering condolences. She was saying how sorry she was. She was saying she'd only just found out and she couldn't believe it, and Emily had always been such a good person and her family must be absolutely devastated. Emily put down the document she was holding. She read the message again. Then she opened Facebook on her laptop, the old account, the one she hadn't posted on in 2 years, the one her family knew about. And she found it. The post from her mother. Dated 3 weeks earlier. Posted publicly, visible to anyone. A photograph. Emily's graduation photo. The one where she looked young and uncertain and slightly overwhelmed. Above a block of text that Jean Carrick had written with the careful sentimentality of someone composing for an audience. Our darling Emily, Jean had written, taken from us too soon in a tragic accident on the M8. She is with the angels now, and we will carry her in our hearts always. There will be a memorial service at St. Benedict's Church in Easterhouse on January 11th at 2:30 in the afternoon. All who loved her are welcome. In lieu of flowers, donations too. Emily stopped reading. She sat very still on her good sofa in her flat in Finiston, the deal documents scattered around her, the coffee machine humming in the kitchen, and she breathed very carefully for a moment. There was a memorial service. Her mother had written a public obituary. There were, when she looked further, over 200 comments of condolence. Relatives and old neighbors and former teachers all expressing grief for a death that had not happened. And there, buried in the comments, was a link to a donation page, in Emily's memory, for a charity that Emily had no connection to, with a running total that had already reached £400. £400. She understood in that moment the full shape of what had happened, not just the cruelty or the absurdity of it, but the mechanics. Her mother had lost contact with her. Rather than considering that Emily might have changed her number, might have moved on, might simply be living her life without them, rather than filing a missing person report or contacting hospitals, or doing any of the ordinary things a person does when someone they love actually disappears. Jean Carrick had constructed a narrative. A death. A tragedy. A story that positioned her as the grieving mother rather than the parent whose daughter had walked away. And it was working. People were comforting her. People were giving money. People were gathering on January 11th in a church in Easterhouse to mourn someone who was alive and 30 miles away and had a meeting at 4 with Series A investors. Something shifted in Emily in that moment. She had been content, more than content, actually committed, to building her life quietly, separate and parallel, letting her family carry whatever version of her they preferred. She had accepted the distance. She had made peace with not being known by them. But this was something categorically different. This was not dismissal. This was erasure. They had not just decided she was too limited to succeed. They had decided she was too forgettable to even investigate. They had turned her disappearance into a performance, and the performance was generating sympathy and apparently money. And somewhere in a church in Easterhouse, there was a photograph of her on a stand near the altar while her mother cried real tears for a fictional tragedy. She could not be silent about this. Silence now would make her complicit, would make her an accomplice to a lie being performed for an audience of people she had known her whole life. She sat with the decision for a long time. She turned it over, examined it from every angle, looked for the arguments against it. She found them. It would be uncomfortable, it would be confrontational, it would drag her back into a dynamic she'd worked hard to escape. She set those arguments aside, because the argument for was simple and unanswerable. They were lying. They were using her death as theater, and the only person who could stop it was the person who wasn't dead. Emily Carrick decided to attend her own memorial service. She gave herself 3 weeks to prepare. Not 3 weeks of planning the confrontation. She didn't want a confrontation. Not exactly. 3 weeks of deciding who she would be when she walked through those doors. Because that was the choice. She could walk in wearing the worn coat and the scuffed trainers, looking exactly as her family expected her to look, and let the revelation of her survival be enough of a shock without anything else. Or she could walk in looking like who she actually was, like someone who had built something, who had earned something, who had arrived at the point where she no longer needed to hide what she'd become. She thought about it carefully in the way she thought about everything carefully, not as performance but as strategy, which is what she had always been good at. The worn coat was a kind of armor she had worn so long it had fused to her skin, and it was armor against a specific threat. The threat of her family seeing her succeed and still finding a reason to discount it. There would be ways to discount it if she walked in looking shabby. She could almost hear them. It was scripted already in her head, her mother's voice finding the register that said, "See, even with all her claims, she's still the same girl from Aberdalgie Road who couldn't pass her hires." She could hear Craig's version of the laugh that meant, "That's more like it." She could hear the grinding mechanism of a family that had decided who she was and would spend the rest of their lives looking for evidence that confirmed the decision. She would not give them that evidence, not this time. She bought the rice dress, deep navy, fitted, simple, that she had admired in a shop window on Buchanan Street 3 months earlier, and walked past because she hadn't felt ready to wear it. She bought the Isabel Marant boots she'd been putting off, good leather, the kind that would last 15 years with decent care. She made an appointment at Sloane's on Argyle Street, and sat in the chair and let the stylist do what the stylist was skilled at doing. And when she looked in the mirror afterward, she recognized herself, the self she'd been becoming, in a way she hadn't quite expected. She looked successful because she was successful. She had stopped hiding it. She also, in those 3 weeks, made a practical decision that she did not discuss with anyone. She consulted briefly with a solicitor, just a single conversation over the phone, about the donation page, whether accepting charitable donations raised in the name of a living person created any legal liability. The answer was nuanced and the conversation was short, and she decided that pursuing it legally was not what she wanted. What she wanted was something more direct. She wanted to be present, in the room, and let her presence do what legal letters could not. There were moments in those 3 weeks when she wavered. Not about going. She was certain about going. But about the right approach, the right register, the right version of herself to bring into the room. She talked herself through it on walks along the Clyde in the evenings, the river gray and wide and uninterested, the way rivers always are. She wrote things in her notebook and crossed them out. She drafted, in her head, versions of what she might say that were angrier, that had edges, that would cut, and then she set those drafts aside. Not because the anger was illegitimate, but because the anger was not the point. The point was clarity. The point was that 73 people had gathered to mourn her, and she was going to walk into that room and give them the truth, which was that she was alive and present and had been all along. And she was going to say it without theater and without cruelty, and without allowing herself to be reduced to the role they had cast her in. She was not going to perform the angry daughter. She was not going to perform anything. She was just going to be there, which was the most radical thing she could possibly do. She told Marcus, her COO, only that she needed the afternoon of January 11th free, and that it was a family matter. Marcus had raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which was one of the many reasons she trusted Marcus. She rescheduled the 4 o'clock meeting to the following morning, apologizing to the investors briefly, citing a personal commitment. She arrived at the office on January 10th, the day before, and worked steadily through the day, clearing her desk of anything time-sensitive, delegating what needed delegating. She stayed late, after everyone else had gone. She sat in the quiet office and looked out at the St. Andrew Square lights coming on in the dark, and she thought about what she was going to do tomorrow, and she felt something she recognized, eventually, as the specific calm that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from certainty about the necessity of the action. She had no speech prepared. She had decided against a speech. Whatever she said tomorrow would be what she felt in the room, because scripts break apart under the pressure of real moments, and she had never needed to speak from a script to say what she meant. She knew what she needed to say. She would say it plainly and without theater. The theater was already there, had been staged by her family without her participation. She would simply provide the part they had left out, herself. On the morning of January 11th, she drove to Easter House in her Audi A4, the one she'd bought herself as a Christmas present, the first truly indulgent thing she'd purchased since the company became profitable. She parked 2 streets from St. Benedict's and sat for a moment in the quiet car, watching the gray sky press low over the rooftops. She thought about her mother's kitchen, about the toast smell and the kettle, about 8 words delivered with the flat certainty of settled fact. You've always been thick as mince. Emily. She thought about the 13-year-old at the kitchen table with the notebook, drawing boxes and arrows, folding the page away from Craig's laugh. She thought about the 16-year-old at the bedroom window, code on the screen, her parents' voices audible through the door. She thought about the 27-year-old who had driven back to this street with a contract in her pocket and hope in her chest, and had been sent away in 4 sentences. She thought about every version of herself who had tried to be known in this place, and how none of them had quite managed it. She thought about tomorrow, about the office, about the Edinburgh expansion, about the panel in Berlin, about the team dinner on West Regent Street next week. She thought about all of it, the full specific weight of the life she had built, and she held it in her mind like something real and solid and irreducibly hers, and then she took a breath and got out of the car. The church was fuller than she'd expected. St. Benedict's was not large. Stone-built, Victorian, the kind of church that feels like it's been cold for 100 years, but it was nearly full. She stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone saw her, and she counted. 73 people seated in pews, some in proper dark clothes, some in whatever they'd worn on a Saturday afternoon. She recognized faces from her childhood, her Aunt Patricia, her cousins from Rutherglen, the old woman from the flat below who had always given her boiled sweets when she was small. She recognized two of her former teachers. She recognized neighbors. She recognized the geography of her whole past life assembled in one room to grieve for her. Her parents were in the front row. Her mother had a tissue. Her father sat with his hands on his thighs, formal and stiff, wearing the dark jacket she'd last seen him wear at her grandfather's funeral. Craig was there. Megan was there. The graduation photograph, that one photograph they'd had from the ceremony where she'd looked young and uncertain, stood on a stand near the altar, flanked by flowers. There was a wreath, white carnations, the cheaper kind, the kind that smelled sweet in a way that always made Emily think of hospitals. There was a small table beside the photograph with a few objects, a candle, a printed order of service that she couldn't read from the doorway, what looked like a sympathy card propped against the photograph's frame. The whole arrangement had the particular quality of something assembled with genuine feeling, and she held that in her mind alongside everything else. Her mother had felt something real in constructing this. The grief was not entirely theater, even if the death was entirely fiction. Jean Carrick had lost her daughter, not to a crash on the M8, but to a kitchen conversation about being thick as mints, and in her own way she had been mourning that loss for 18 months. Emily could see that. She could hold that truth without letting it change what needed to happen today. She walked down the center aisle. The first whisper came when she was 6 rows from the back. She heard her name, uncertain, questioning. Then she heard it again, louder. Someone gasped. An actual sharp gasp, the kind that belongs in old stories. She kept walking. She kept her pace deliberate and steady, heel-toe on the stone floor, and she watched the reaction ripple forward through the congregation like a stone dropped in water, the heads turning one by one, the mouths opening, the confusion spreading. She was aware of how she looked, and she was aware that she had made choices about how she looked, and she did not feel shame about that. She held herself the way she had learned to hold herself in boardrooms and on panel stages, straight, unhurried, present, not performing, simply occupying her own space with the full confidence of someone who has earned the right to be exactly where they are. The dress, the boots, the hair, none of it was armor now. It was just her, the real version. The version that had existed in this city for 18 months while her family were lighting candles for the fiction. Her mother turned at the front of the church when the whispering reached her. Jean Carrick's face went white. Not pale. White. The white of sudden systemic shock. All blood evacuating at once. Her father stood up and his mouth opened and closed. And he looked like someone who has looked up from a map to discover the road doesn't exist. Megan made a sound, something between a gasp and Emily's name, half-formed, cut off by the fact that her lungs didn't know what to do with the air. Craig was on his feet, hands gripping the back of the pew in front of him, staring with an expression that Emily read as disorientation rather than recognition, as if his brain was running a comparison between the person he expected to see and the person walking toward him and finding that the images did not match. Emily walked all the way to the front of the church. She turned and faced the congregation, 73 people, every one of them staring. The church was absolutely comprehensively silent. "Hello," she said. Her voice was clear and steady and filled the stone space without effort. "I'm Emily Carrick. As you can see, I'm not dead." The silence held for a beat longer. Then her mother found her voice. "Emily, what are you— you can't just—" The sentence didn't find its end because there was no grammatical structure that could hold what was actually happening. "Can't just what, Mum?" Emily kept her voice level. There was no heat in it. No performance of anger. She was not performing. She was simply there, solid and present and alive, in a room where she had been enshrined as absent. Show up to my own funeral? Walk into a church where you're mourning someone who's alive? Her father's face was moving through colors, the white of shock giving way to the red of what she recognized as his defensive anger, the flush that came up when he felt cornered. "You don't understand. We were told. Who told you?" She watched him. "Who told you I was dead?" The silence answered that question. "No one told you." She waited a moment, let the words settle into the stone. "You stopped being able to reach me, and instead of considering that maybe I'd changed my number, that maybe I'd simply moved on with my life, You decided I must have died. I need you to understand what I'm asking. Why was that your first conclusion? Why did death seem more likely than distance? Her sister Megan stood up, and there was genuine distress in her face, genuine upset. Emily saw that and noted it, filed it away. You just disappeared. You cut us off. I changed my number, Megan. I moved flats. I moved on. People do that. It isn't the same as dying. But you never told us where you went. Her mother's voice had gone from shock into a quieter, more desolate register, tears streaming now, real ones. You just vanished, Emily. You left, and you were just gone. Emily felt something inside her settle in that moment. It was not cold, what she felt. It was not triumphant. It was something more like the release of a door finally closing on a room she had been trying to leave for a long time. She looked at her mother's crying face and felt the grief for it that she'd always been going to feel, and also felt the clarity that had brought her here. I left, she said, because every time I came home you treated me as if I was stupid, as if I was a burden, as if I was someone to be managed rather than known. That's not... Her mother was stammering. You've always been thick as mince, Emily. She quoted it back quietly. 8 words, the exact 8 words, dropped back into the same space they'd come from. She watched her mother's face when she heard them, the flinch, the recognition, the specific shame of being held to your own words. November 12th, 18 months ago, in your kitchen, standing by the kettle with your arms crossed. Dad laughed and said I should leave the thinking to people with proper brains. You both said that. You said it while I was trying to tell you about something I'd built. I remember every syllable. Her father's jaw set. Even here, even now, there was the familiar reflex, the defensiveness rising like a wall. You have to understand, Emily, you weren't exactly successful at that point. We were managing your expectations, trying to keep you from disappointment. She looked at him. She let a moment pass. I founded a company, she said, and her voice was not raised, not triumphant, not anything but quiet and factual. Carrick Solutions. We develop logistics software for mid-sized distribution companies. We were valued at $4.7 million in our first year of operation. I own 68% of it. I employ 14 people in our Glasgow office and 6 more in Manchester. I am not unsuccessful, Dad. She held his gaze. You just never asked. The church was so quiet she could hear someone breathing near the back. The stone walls held the silence the way stone walls do, absolute and cold and old. Her brother Craig stood up. He had his father's jaw, Craig, the same set, the same defensive line. There's no way, you're making that up, Emily pulled out her phone. She opened the Tech Scotland article. She'd had it bookmarked since publication, not out of vanity, but out of the same instinct that makes you keep a receipt. She held the phone up so the nearest people could see the photograph, her face on the screen, her name in the headline. December issue. There's a photo. You can look it up on your phone right now, any of you. Search for Carrick Solutions or search my name. It's all public record. It's been public for months. She lowered the phone and looked at her brother. You could have found this. Any of you could have found this. You'd have had to look. She watched Craig's expression move through the phases she had always been able to read in him. The first refusal. Then the recognition that refusal in a room this full would make him look worse than accepting. And finally, most significantly, a kind of stillness that she didn't recognize from her childhood. It was the stillness of someone reassessing, not surrender. Craig was too much his father's son for that for now, but something close to it. Something that might, with time and enough honest thinking, become it. She noted it without dwelling on it. There were more important things to say. Her mother was shaking her head, not denying, Emily noticed, but refusing. The two things look similar from the outside, but they are entirely different from the inside. Denial says it isn't true. Refusal says it cannot be true, and the distinction tells you everything. So here's what I need to understand, Emily said. She turned slightly, addressing not just her family but the room, the 73 witnesses. She felt no embarrassment about this. They were here. They had been part of this. They were part of the record now. You believed I was too limited to succeed at anything. When I disappeared from your lives, you didn't consider that I might be working, that I might be building something, that I might be living. You thought I'd died. And then, instead of doing any of the things a family actually does when someone dies, instead of filing a missing person report, instead of contacting hospitals, instead of any of that, you organized a memorial service. You posted about it publicly. You accepted sympathy. She paused. And donations. Her mother's face crumpled fully at that. And it was the donations that crumpled it. Emily could see which words landed where. We were grieving, her mother whispered, for someone who wasn't dead. We didn't know that. You didn't check. And there it was, the iron in her voice. Not anger, something steadier than anger. You didn't look. You didn't search. You didn't ask anyone if they'd heard from me. You didn't do the one thing that would have taken 30 seconds. She held her mother's gaze. You typed my name into Google and found the article, did you? No, you assumed. Because it was easier to assume I was gone than to imagine I was somewhere building something you'd told me I was too thick to build. Her father moved then, stood a little straighter, made the push that she'd known he would make. Because he was her father and she knew him and she'd known this moment was coming since she walked through the doors. Even here, even faced with all of this, he couldn't surrender. He wasn't built for it. You still should have told us, he said, and his voice had found some firmness again. You had no right to just cut us off. Whatever we said, you could have... You owed us communication, Emily. He gestured at the church, at the flowers, at the photograph, as if she were responsible for all of it. This is what happens when you just vanish. Emily looked at her father. She looked at this man she had loved and feared in equal measure for 29 years. This man who had laughed in a kitchen in Easter House and told her to leave the thinking to people with proper brains. This man who was standing in a church at his living daughter's memorial service, and still, somehow, finding a way to position himself as wronged. I'm embarrassing you, she said. He held her gaze. Dad, she said very quietly. You held a funeral for your living daughter, rather than consider she might have succeeded without you. She turned then, turned to look out at the faces in the pews, the neighbors and the cousins and the old teachers and the woman from the flat below who had given her boiled sweets when she was small. She looked at every face she could find, and she asked the question that had been building since November, since the kitchen in Easter House, since a gray Tuesday 18 months ago, when she had walked out of that flat and driven away. What does it say about how you saw me? She said. That death seemed more likely than success. The words went into the stone and stayed there. Her mother made a sound, not a sentence, not words, just a sound. The sound a person makes when something breaks open in them that they didn't know was still closed. Her father looked away, and in the looking away she saw everything she needed to see, the old defiance softening finally into something that looked, from the outside, very much like shame. She looked at them both. She looked at Craig, who had sat back down and was staring at the floor. She looked at Megan, who was crying, quietly, one hand pressed to her mouth, and whose tears looked genuine because they were genuine. And Emily, despite everything, loved her sister and was not glad to see her cry. She breathed. I'm going to walk out of this church, she said. I'm going to go back to my life, my real life, the one I built. The one that exists whether or not you knew about it. What happens next is your decision, not mine. She held her mother's eyes for a moment. If you want to know me, actually know me, the person I am instead of the person you decided I was, my business email is public. It's on the website. You can reach me there. But you'll need to let go of the version of me you created, the one who was too thick to manage, too limited to achieve anything, too incompetent to survive without your guidance. She let that sit for a moment. That person never existed. She was a story you told yourselves, and you told it so often you believed it. And then when she disappeared, you assumed she must have died because you couldn't imagine any other ending for her. She looked at them. At all of them. At her whole past, assembled in pews. You'll need to decide if you can know the real me, she said. I'll wait to hear from you. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle. The congregation parted as she moved. Not dramatically. No one stood aside like a crowd in a film. They simply moved, shifting in their seats, unconsciously making space for her as she passed. She heard nothing clearly, just a blurred undersound of breathing and rustling and the particular silence of a room processing something it hasn't finished processing yet. She kept her eyes forward. Heel toe, steady on the stone. At the back of the church, she was nearly at the doors when she felt someone touch her arm, just briefly, lightly. The touch of someone who wanted to stop her for a moment without demanding it. She turned. It was Mrs. Gallagher from the flat below. She had to be in her 80s now, white-haired and small, her eyes sharp and dark in a face that had folded itself into decades of expression. She had given Emily boiled sweets from a tartan tin when Emily was 7, 8, 9 years old, usually on the stairs between floors, a wordless gesture of neighborly warmth. She looked at Emily now for a long moment. She looked the way very old people sometimes look, past the surface, with the specific focus of someone who has stopped being interested in pretense. "I knew," the old woman said quietly. "I always knew." And then, because she was Mrs. Gallagher and she had never been someone who elaborated beyond what was necessary, she patted Emily's arm once and let her go. Emily carried those 3 words out through the doors of St. Benedict's and into the January air, and she held them carefully, the way you hold something small and unexpectedly weighty. I always knew. She carried those 3 words carefully. She turned them over, looked at them from different angles, felt the full weight of what was packed inside their simplicity. 3 words that contained decades of quiet observation. 3 words that said, in this building, in this stairwell, in this neighborhood where everyone had a fixed opinion of who you were, there was at least one person who saw further than the opinion, who saw the girl with the laptop and understood something about where the girl was going, even when the girl herself could barely hold on to that understanding. 3 words that were, in their own way, the opposite of 8 words spoken in a kitchen. Not a diminishment, but a recognition, offered not with the force of authority, but with the gentleness of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to gain. She stood for a moment on the pavement outside the church. The January air was cold and sharp and clean, the kind of Glasgow cold that comes in off the Clyde and reminds you that the city is built at the edge of things, that there are long stretches of wild water to the west, and the air knows it. She breathed it in. She tilted her face toward the sky for just a moment, towards the low gray light that had been the light of her childhood, and she let it be what it was. Not romantic, not dramatic, just the sky over Easterhouse, the same sky she'd always seen from that bedroom window. She thought about Mrs. Gallagher for a long moment, standing there on the cold pavement with the sound of the congregation behind her, beginning to find its voice again, a low murmur leaking through the heavy doors. She thought about those 3 words and what they contained, not just the recognition, but the duration of it. I always knew meant years. Meant a woman on the stairs between floors who had watched a girl carry a laptop up to her room and understood something about what was in that girl, and had never said it aloud, perhaps because she understood that saying it aloud in a house like that one would have served no purpose. Meant a quiet witness who had been holding a piece of evidence that no one had thought to ask her for. Emily felt the particular ache of that, of being known, truly known, by someone who had no standing to change anything, and of the long years in which that knowledge had sat uncollected, like a package left on a doorstep that nobody thought to open. She would visit Mrs. Gallagher, not today, but soon. She would bring good tea, the proper kind, loose leaf, the kind old women who live alone deserve. And she would sit in that flat and hear whatever the old woman wanted to say. And she would say thank you, and mean it with the full weight of what those 3 words had cost to hold quietly for so many years. She pulled out her phone. 2 messages from her COO, Marcus, about the Manchester expansion timeline. One from the Series A investors, following up on their last conversation about terms. One from her estate agent about the West End flat she was viewing next week. The one with the bay windows overlooking Kelvin Grove Park. The one that had felt, when she'd first stood in it, like the shape of a life she'd been building toward. She scrolled through them with the efficient focus of someone who has somewhere real to be. She walked back to her Audi, got in, put the heater on. Sat for a moment in the car, and in that moment, something she hadn't expected happened. She missed her mother. She missed her with a clean, specific ache. The way you miss someone you love when you understand finally and completely that love is not the same as being able to be with them. That sometimes the distance between love and presence is a distance you cannot close no matter how much you want to. She allowed herself to feel it. She didn't try to rationalize it or resolve it. She just felt it, and then she started the car. The meeting was at 4. Her team dinner was at 7, at the Italian place on West Regent Street, where the owner always remembered everyone's orders. She had a conference call tomorrow morning with the Berlin organizers about the panel she'd been asked to join in March, Logistics Optimization in the European Distribution Sector, her name on the program next to people who'd been in the industry for decades. She had a life. It was a real, specific, detailed, fully realized life, and it had nothing to do with funerals. She drove toward the city center as the afternoon light started to fail over Glasgow, that particular dimming that happens early in January, the light going out of the sky while you're still expecting afternoon. She drove past the merchant city streets where she'd rented her tiny room, past the co-working space on Argyle Street, past the sandwich shop where she'd eaten lunch for a year, while her company became the thing it became. She drove through the city she had built herself in, quietly, without display, without anyone's permission or blessing or belief. She wasn't angry anymore. She'd understood this somewhere in the middle of the drive away from Easter House, with Mrs. Gallagher's 3 words still sitting warm somewhere in her chest. The anger had been real, it had been valid, it had been appropriate, but it had served its purpose. It had carried her to the moment she needed to reach, and now it could be set down. What she felt instead was something that didn't have a simple word for it. It was the feeling of having completed a circuit, of having gone back to the beginning and looked at it clearly and said the true thing and left the choice with the people who needed to make it. She had done what she could do. She had shown up. She had spoken plainly. She had walked back out. Whatever her family did next, whether her mother found the website and typed out a careful email, whether her father let himself sit long enough with his shame to soften it into something workable, whether Megan picked up the phone with a different kind of conversation in mind, that was theirs. She could not do it for them. She was not responsible for it. She had left the door open and marked it clearly and handed them the key. And if they didn't come through it, she would be all right. She had been all right. She knew how to be all right now in a way she hadn't known before, with the specific confidence of someone who has built their own floor and tested it and found it solid. The weeks after January 11th moved with the velocity of real work, which is to say they moved fast and were full of the particular texture of progress. The Series A round closed. The Edinburgh office signed its lease, a proper office now, not a rented desk, a whole floor in a building on St. Andrew's Square with windows and a meeting room and a kitchen. She hired 3 more people in February, then 2 more in March. The Berlin conference went well. Better than she'd expected, actually. She sat on the panel between a Dutch logistics executive who'd been in the industry for 30 years and a tech journalist who asked sharp questions, and she held her own, and then some. 14 people in the Glasgow office noticed that something in her had shifted after January. Marcus, her COO, said she seemed lighter, which she found funny. She'd expected to feel heavier after what had happened at the church, weighted down by grief or complication or the residue of family drama. Instead, she felt like someone who had put down a bag they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten they were carrying it. She felt her own weight. She felt the actual size of herself, without the family narrative pressing down on it from above. She thought about that sometimes, about weight and narrative, in the early mornings in the Finneystown flat, with the coffee machine humming and the city still quiet through the bay window. The family narrative had been a kind of gravity. It had not stopped her moving. But it had cost her something every time she moved against it. The extra expenditure of energy required to override a force that was always pulling her back toward the shape they'd decided she occupied. The effort had been so constant and so long-standing that she'd forgotten it was effort. She had thought it was just what moving felt like. It was only now, on the other side of January 11th, that she felt the difference. Movement without resistance. The particular ease of a life that no longer required justification to the people who'd told her it was impossible. She moved into the West End flat in February. Bay windows, original cornicing, the view over Kelvingrove Park where in spring the dog walkers would appear and the trees would come into leaf. and the whole green geometry of it would unfold below her window. She bought a proper dining table, a big one, oak, the kind that could seat 8, because she had people to feed now. Her team and her friends, and the specific growing network of people who had become real parts of her real life. She cooked a proper dinner the first weekend she was in the flat, the mince and tatties she'd learned from her mother's kitchen, and she sat at the big oak table with Marcus and 2 other colleagues and a friend from Edinburgh, and the dinner was excellent. She thought about her mother while she was cooking. She thought about Jean Carrick standing at a stove in Easter House, the wooden spoon moving through the mince and onion, the smell that was the smell of coming home. She thought about all the things her mother had given her that her mother would not have recognized as gifts, the stubbornness, the patience, the ability to work without rest on something that mattered, the absolute refusal to abandon a thing she believed in. These were her mother's qualities. Emily had inherited them. She had used them to build something her mother could not have imagined, and she held that contradiction carefully, the way you hold all the true things that do not resolve cleanly into lessons. She had not yet told anyone at work about what had happened at the church. It didn't feel like something to share in a professional context, and she had no framework for how the conversation would even begin. She had mentioned it once, briefly, to a friend from Edinburgh, a woman she'd met through the Series A process, who had her own complicated family history and the particular capacity for direct response that complicated families sometimes produce. The friend had listened. Then she had said, "You know what the most remarkable thing about that is? You didn't do it to punish them. You did it to tell the truth." Emily had sat with that for a while. She thought it was accurate. She thought the distinction mattered. Punishment is about making someone feel the weight of what they've done. Truth is about making the record correct. She had been interested on January 11th in the record and in the people who had assembled in that church with a piece of information they deserved to have revised. The record was now corrected. What her family did with the revised record was, as she had said, their decision. 3 weeks after the memorial service, she received an email. It came to her business address. The email address she'd made public. It had no subject line, which struck her as very much like her mother. The body of the message was 2 sentences. "I'm sorry, Emily. I don't know how to say more than that yet, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." Emily read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she typed back, "Thank you. I'm here when you're ready." She did not know what would come next. She thought it might be slow, probably halting, probably full of moments where the old habits surfaced and someone said something that still stung. She thought there would be difficult conversations, and some of them would go well and some of them wouldn't. She thought her father might not get there at all, might be too calcified in his pride to bend toward something different, and she thought that would be sad, and also probably true to who he was. She thought Megan might be the surprising one, that Megan's tears in the church had been genuine, and that genuine things could sometimes grow. 2 days after her mother's email, a shorter message arrived from a different address. No greeting, no signature, just 4 words. I looked it up. She recognized Craig's economy with language, if nothing else. She sat with those 4 words longer than she'd sat with her mother's apology. Because what those 4 words meant was that her brother, the clever one, the one the family had always held up as the standard, had finally, after a lifetime of not looking, typed her name into a search engine, had seen her face in the Tech Scotland article, had sat with that for 2 days and written 4 words. It was not enough. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, she had learned in the past 18 months, were where everything started. She replied to Craig with 2 words. Good start. She thought sometimes about what it meant to be seen for the first time by people who had been looking at you your whole life. It was one of the stranger experiences she could name. Stranger in some ways than walking down the center aisle of a church toward your own photograph. Because the church moment had been public, had been sharp and immediate, had moved in the rapid time of confrontation. This was slower. This was the long, uncertain business of revision, of people who had carried a fixed image of you for decades beginning, painstakingly, to update it. Her mother's 2 sentences. Craig's 4 words. She did not know what would come from Megan or from her father. She did not know if her father would come at all. But she understood that she had, by showing up at the church, introduced a piece of information that could not be unintroduced. She was alive. She had built something. She was the person who had walked down that aisle in the navy dress and the good boots and spoken plainly in front of 73 witnesses. That person now existed in the public record of her family's memory, and it was a record that could not be revised back to the version they had preferred. She had overwritten it, not with anger, not with theater, but with the simple, irrefutable fact of herself. That was what she had gone there to do. That was what she had done. She didn't know. She was prepared for not knowing. She had learned, in 18 months of building something from nothing in a city that does not give things away easily, that you cannot predict the outcome of things you haven't started yet. You can only begin and do the work, and see what the work becomes. There is something that research consistently shows about people who are underestimated, and studies on this particular dynamic appear in developmental psychology, in organizational research, in the literature on family systems and chronic dismissal. The pattern is documented and clear. People who are consistently told by their inner circle that they are limited will, in a significant majority of cases, conform to that limit. They will stop trying the things they're told they cannot do. They will internalize the assessment and make it true by living it. This is the power of the family narrative. It is one of the most potent forces in human psychology, more durable than most external criticism, harder to escape than most forms of discouragement. We believe the people who were there first. We give them a credibility that strangers and colleagues never receive, because they knew us before we knew ourselves, and we assume that knowledge is irreversible. What makes Emily's story rare is not that she succeeded. It is that she succeeded without anyone's belief in her. She built something real in the complete absence of her family's faith, in the dark, with the tools she'd taught herself to use when nobody was watching. And in doing so, she proved something that statistics cannot capture, but that we intuitively recognize as true. The ceiling your family puts on you is not a ceiling of your capacity. It is a ceiling of their imagination. The limit they assign you is the limit of their ability to see you, not the limit of who you can become. The most dangerous thing your inner circle can do is not doubt you loudly. The most dangerous thing is to doubt you with such confident, casual certainty that the doubt settles in quietly. Feels like common sense, feels like wisdom, feels like someone who loves you telling you the truth for your own good. That is the kind of doubt that Emily carried for years, half believing it, before she found her way to the other side of it. And the other side of it is what you build when you stop asking for permission to be real. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of something you've carried, or someone who doubted you, or a version of yourself you had to fight for, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. And leave a comment. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely that they couldn't even imagine you alive without them? I read every single one, and I want to know what this brought up for you. If you're not subscribed yet, join the family. We tell these stories every week, the ones that are too real and too complicated for neat endings. And wherever you're watching from right now, whether it's Glasgow on a gray afternoon or somewhere warmer and further away, and whatever time it is where you are, thank you for being here. Now go watch the video that's on your screen. Because I'll tell you this much, the story waiting there is going to shake something loose in you. Someone made a decision that everyone around them said was impossible, and what happened next is the kind of thing that makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew about who gets to win. I'll see you there.